Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to talk about the 5th generation of consoles and give my thoughts about which system was the best. I'm going to have individual categories and declare the winner of each one before naming my champion. I want to reiterate that this is very much my own subjective opinion, based on my personal experience and research, so please consider this as nothing more than a bit of fun. If you disagree with any of my points, then let me know in the comments. Anyway, we're going to go with the first category, which is innovation. The Sega Saturn's initial unique selling point was bringing arcade standard games into your living room, which to be fair had been done already 5 years earlier with SNK's Neo Geo. However, with each game for that system retailing from $200 to $300 each back in 1990, which in today's money is up to $720 per game, the idea of having arcade standard games in your home at an affordable cost was very appealing and had yet to be done. Games like Metal Slug, Marvel Superheroes, Cotton, and Virtua Cop on the Saturn would look almost identical to their arcade counterparts, and many more of Sega's arcade games would get very respectable ports on the Saturn. This would encourage SNK to bring out a CD version of their Neo Geo console in response, but it was too little too late, as the Saturn had a strong hold as the go-to home console arcade system, especially in the Japanese market. The Saturn was also the first console to offer RAM expansion in simple cartridge form, which made the system an absolute 2D powerhouse. Nintendo would take inspiration from this and eventually follow suit with their own version 2 years later. Nintendo during the N64 era innovated so many things which would go on to be industry standard. It was the first console that introduced a controller specifically designed for 3D movement along a Z-axis. Both Sega and Sony would release their own controller upgrades in response, but this was after the Nintendo 64's release. The controller also had a slot at the back for interchangeable add-ons, such as the first ever Rumble Pack, Game Boy Transfer Pack, and even a microphone. It was also the first console to have 4 controller ports. 4-player GoldenEye, Mario Kart, Pokemon Stadium, and Mario Party were an absolute delight. It was the ultimate multiplayer console, with more than 2 people playing simultaneously. As a kid, I was convinced that Sony simply stole all of its ideas from Nintendo, but now I'm an adult and drop that fanboyism, while being genuinely surprised about how much Sony innovated with its first console when I really dug deep into its history. Sony made a very premeditated and conscious effort to make their console primarily a 3D one, to the extent that they initially refused to grant concept approval of any 2D game to third-party developers, with Sony even supporting developers against their will to make the transition into 3D. Although 3D gaming on home consoles wasn't new per se, Sony made it the industry standard, and as a consequence it fast-tracked the industry and instantly made the Saturn look like inferior hardware, with their 3D efforts simply not looking as crisp as the PlayStation's. The affordable arcade at home, which had comparatively worse 3D, became an afterthought in the West, as Sony set the new standard. Other innovations demonstrated by the PlayStation 1 included the DualShock controller, the first controller with 2 joysticks, and the first which had joysticks as clickable buttons. Dual analogs would eventually be copied by both Nintendo and Microsoft going forward, and it became the absolute way to play 3D platformers and first-person shooters. Sony were also all in on memory cards and CDs, which made the console and its games a lot more affordable. Although they had been done previously, Sega would flip-flop between cartridges and CDs with their Genesis add-ons, and the Saturn primarily had a hard drive for their system saves, which got wiped when the battery died. After the PlayStation's launch, launch, Sega would ditch their system hard drive for the Dreamcast, and Nintendo would do the same with the GameCube and use memory cards as the primary way of saving game data. The PlayStation was also hugely influential in making gaming a mainstream, acceptable for adults form of entertainment, with its stylish aesthetic, mature content, and deliberate marketing towards teenagers and young adults. Right. So who gets the point on innovation? Ultimately, Sega's arcade-at-home unique selling point became too niche and perhaps wasn't thinking enough outside of the box to truly be considered next generation. The N64, despite introducing amazing innovations, didn't quite set as many industry standards in the same way the PlayStation 1 did, with their traditional cartridge format really hurting them. So I have to give this point to the PlayStation 1. Technical capabilities. As mentioned previously, the Sega Saturn brought arcade standard games into the home, and especially with the RAM expansion, it was an absolute 2D powerhouse. All 2D games looked superior on the Saturn compared with the competition, and the sprites in X-Men vs Street Fighter really demonstrated its 2D power over the PlayStation. Despite being difficult to develop for, there are examples of 3D games which looked great, such as Panzer Dragoon 2, Burning Rangers, and Virtua Fighter 2. Unlike the N64, the Saturn could also play music CDs, which made it a convenient multimedia device. And while being niche at the time, the Sega Saturn could also connect to the internet via Sega Link, which was mind-blowing for the time. When it comes to raw power, the N64 had by far the best 3D graphics of all three systems, with a higher polygon count, a much higher colour palette, and more than double the amount of RAM compared with the PlayStation. Its best looking games would simply not be possible on either the Saturn or the PlayStation 1 without being massively compromised. The expansion pack also allowed games like Donkey Kong 64 and Perfect Dark to run on the system, which looked really great for the time and produced by far the best graphics on any home console. Some would consider the PlayStation as the best all-rounder in that it didn't do 2D as well as the Saturn or 3D as well as the N64, but it was able to handle both effectively. The huge advantage of the PlayStation over the Nintendo 64 is that it used a CD format instead of cartridges. A PlayStation 1 CD could hold up to 700 megabytes versus a cartridge's pathetic 64. This meant things like full motion video and frequent expansive cutscenes were not possible on any Nintendo 64 game. The limitations of using cartridges meant that the likes of Square, Namco, Konami, and Capcom would prioritize the PlayStation, as games such as Final Fantasy simply weren't possible without being heavily compromised. In response, Nintendo would eventually release an add-on called the 64DD, but it was never released outside of Japan, and it was abandoned early. Like the Saturn, the PlayStation could also play music CDs, but it was much easier to develop for, which helped games developers get the very best out of the console. On technical capabilities, who gets the point? Ironically, the Saturn has arguably aged the best of all three systems, as its crisp 2D games still look great today and wouldn't look out of place on any modern console. However, considering there's still an interest in playing 3D games of this era, many N64 games such as Star Fox, Mario 64, and Zelda still hold up okay today. While the PlayStation 1's 3D looked great for the time, it's simply not aged as well, with long loading times in many of its games too. With all of this in mind, despite its cartridge limitations, I'm going to give the point to the Nintendo 64, purely for having the best looking graphics without any loading times. Controller. The Sega Saturn's controller on the surface didn't look too different from the Genesis one, but it's gone on to still be a viable option today. It was designed mainly for 2D games and was arguably the best in that category. The design was so popular that years after the Saturn discontinued, Sega would release a version for the PlayStation 2 and also modern variations for PC and current consoles, still unchanged from its original design. Sega would also release a 3D controller, which was the perfect option for games such as Nights into Dreams and Burning Rangers. This would heavily influence the Dreamcast pad, which is one I personally love too. The different color variants in Japan look great, and I continue to be a huge fan of them both. The N64's controller was revolutionary and specifically designed for 3D gaming. At the time, it was perfect for games like GoldenEye and Mario 64, but you could change your hand position and use the D-pad instead for wrestling games, which made it really versatile. The ability to plug in the rumble pack also really enhanced the experience. The controller gets a bad rap in hindsight, but I don't personally remember anyone complaining about it at the time. The PlayStation 1 controller was similar to the Super Nintendo one, but now with arms and extra shoulder buttons. The design was very stylish, and Sony would go on to release the DualShock, which added 2 analog sticks, ideal for first-person shooters and 3D platformers. The fact that the PlayStation's controller design hasn't changed too much in over 30 years is a true testament to how great this was, and how they got it so right the first time of asking. Now, who gets this point? For me, while I found the N64 controller good for the time, it's not aged well, and I found myself buying Retro Fighters controllers to play games on that console instead, which more closely resemble a modern layout. The joysticks were also really prone to being worn out compared with the analogs on both the DualShock and the Saturn's 3D pad. And while the PlayStation 1 controller was good, it could give my thumb blisters after continued use with their D-pad button. I'm also not personally a fan of the positioning of the left analog stick to move your character, so for me, all things considered, I'm going to give this point to the Sega Saturn. While I didn't let this influence its score, I'm having a great time using their modern retro-bit wireless controllers. I really hope they make one based on their 3D model too. The final category is Best Games. The Sega Saturn had over 1,000 games released for it, which is a library any console owner should be proud of. The Saturn was incredibly popular in Japan and outsold the N64 there, with its huge library of arcade-accurate ports. It was also by far the best system to own for 2D fighters, top-down shooters, and side-scrolling beat-em-ups. There were some great light gun games too, like House of the Dead and Virtua Cop, and the 2D platformers have aged like fine wine. All Sega IPs were exclusive to the system, with Sonic spin-offs, Panzer Dragoon, Nights into Dreams, and Virtua Fighter, amongst others you couldn't get on other consoles. The Nintendo 64, while only having about 240 games released for the console, the sheer quality of its heavy hitters is outstanding, and it's not unusual to still see these games on all-time top 10 lists 30 years after their release. Some of my best childhood memories were playing 4-player GoldenEye, No Mercy, Mario Party, Pokemon Stadium, Star Fox, and Mario Kart 64 with friends. It was the ultimate multiplayer console, which had many immersive single-player games too, which are still critically acclaimed today, such as Zelda, Mario 64, and Banjo-Kazooie. All Nintendo and Rare IPs were exclusive to the console, and for me, the sheer quality of these games really made it stand out. The insane popularity of the PlayStation meant the console was supported for over 11 years, with approximately 4,000 games released for the system. It would have the entire Final Fantasy, Tekken, Dino Crisis, Crash Bandicoot, and Spyro series exclusive to their console, and it was the go-to system for both the Tomb Raider and Resident Evil series. It was the ultimate third-party console, with Namco, Capcom, Konami, and Square producing by far their very best games in that generation on the PlayStation. So, which console wins this highly debated final point? Well, it's a matter of opinion, but for what it's worth, I'm going to give my 2 cents. While the Saturn had an impressive library of games, the vast majority of them never left Japan, and it's only with subsequent English translations that most Westerners have finally been able to enjoy them too. Objectively, apart from Sympathy of the Night, which which was also on the PlayStation, you rarely see any of the Saturn library in any critically acclaimed top 50 games of all time. There are those who love its game library, but for me in terms of quality, it doesn't quite stack up to either the Nintendo 64 or PlayStation. And despite the exclusive Sega IPs, for me personally, it was a disappointment to not see Saturn versions of a new Sonic Adventure, Golden Axe, Streets of Rage, or Mickey Mouse Illusion. The N64 was absolutely not the console for you if you were into fighters, serious racers, or RPGs, as these genres were hugely lacking. Another criticism of its library is that many owners often had the same games as each other, with its lack of third-party support hindering its variety of AAA titles compared with the PlayStation. Having said that, for me there is still a lot of exclusive third-party games on the system which perhaps didn't get the recognition they deserved, such as Star Wars Shadows of the Empire, Mystical Ninja, Turok, Body Harvest, Doom 64, Castlevania, Beetle Adventure Racing, and Fighter's Destiny. It's ultimately a personal preference, but as someone who also loves platformers, in terms of quality, I just don't see Crash or Spyro anywhere near the same level as Mario 64 and Banjo-Kazooie. I'd like to think that I'm not being biased towards Nintendo in saying that, because in a lot of ways I think Astro Bot has surpassed Mario, and I would put the Little Big Planet series on the same level, but obviously these didn't arrive until at least the PlayStation 3 era. For this particular generation, unless you're into fighters or serious racers, for me the N64's multiplayer also beats the PlayStation 1's on every other front. So I'd personally give this point to the N64. Now, even if what I said wasn't subjective, does winning 2 out of these 4 categories automatically make the Nintendo 64 better than both the Saturn or PlayStation? No, of course not. In theory, finishing second in every category could still make a console the best one overall. I am interested to hear what you all think though, so let me know your thoughts in the comments. Please like and subscribe to my channel if you enjoyed this content. I look forward to making the next one.